"Daddy, Mommy put something in your glass," said the boy to his millionaire father. During his birthday party, the businessman decided to exchange the glasses with his wife during the toast. 2 hours later, he was shocked by what happened to her. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like this video and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. The amber lights cast a warm glow across the manicured gardens of the Harrison estate, where classical musicians wove between elaborately dressed guests. 8-year-old Thomas Harrison's birthday celebration was nothing short of spectacular, with its theatrical columns and meticulously arranged floral displays. Every detail had been orchestrated to perfection by Victoria Harrison, the Harvard-educated lawyer who had co-founded Prevention Health Institute alongside her husband, James. James Harrison stood near one of the ornate fountains, watching the gathering of influential investors, society figures, and the carefully selected media team documenting the event. His mind wandered to the Institute's latest expansion plans, another series of preventive care clinics that would carry forward the mission he'd embraced after his mother's illness years ago. "Daddy," Thomas tugged at his sleeve, his small voice barely audible above the string quartet. "Mommy put something in your glass." The words hit James like a sudden chill. He looked down at his son, whose blue eyes, so much like Victoria's, held that characteristic innocence that made children's observations all the more potent. James's grip tightened almost imperceptibly around the crystal stem of his champagne flute. Across the garden, Victoria was engaging with a group of potential investors, her midnight blue gown catching the light as she gestured animatedly. 20 years of marriage had taught James to read every nuance of her expression, every subtle shift in her demeanor. Tonight, something felt off. He watched as she excused herself from the group and made her way toward them, her movements as graceful as ever. The familiar scent of her signature perfume wrapped around him as she approached, carrying 2 fresh glasses of champagne. "The Carmichaels just committed to backing the new pediatric wing," Victoria announced, her smile radiant. She held out one of the glasses to James. "I think that deserves a toast, don't you?" James studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. The Victoria he knew, brilliant, dedicated, loving, surely couldn't be behind what Thomas had just suggested. Yet there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. "Actually," James said, managing a smooth smile, "why don't we switch glasses? You always say I pick the better pause." A shadow passed across Victoria's features, so brief anyone else would have missed it. But James caught it, and it sent a wave of unease through his chest. She recovered quickly, laughing that silvery laugh that had first captured his attention at a Harvard alumni event 2 decades ago. "Always so particular," she teased, but her fingers tensed slightly as they exchanged glasses. The next hour passed. In a blur of congratulations and business discussions, James found himself watching Victoria more closely than usual, noting how she seemed to be everywhere at once, charming investors, directing staff, ensuring Thomas was entertained by the children's entertainment team she'd hired. He observed how she skillfully managed to avoid drinking from her glass, always setting it down just as someone approached for a conversation. The unease in his stomach grew, even as he tried to dismiss it as paranoia born from exhaustion. Thomas stayed unusually close to his father throughout the evening, his small hand often finding its way into James's. The boy's earlier words kept echoing in James's mind, making him hyper-aware of every interaction, every glance exchanged with his wife. As the evening wore on, Victoria's perfectly orchestrated celebration continued without a hitch. The guests were enchanted. The media team captured everything with professional discretion, and their son was being showered with attention and gifts. On the surface, it was exactly the kind of event the Harrisons were known for: elegant, influential, and flawlessly executed. But beneath the polished veneer, something had shifted. James found himself watching the security cameras positioned discreetly around the property, wondering if they had captured whatever moment his son had witnessed. He made a mental note to review the footage later, even as he told himself he was overreacting. The string quartet began a new piece, something melancholic that seemed at odds with the celebration, James noticed Victoria swaying slightly near the fountain, her hand reaching out to steady herself against one of the decorative columns. Their eyes met across the garden, and for a moment, he saw something that looked almost like fear in her expression. Victoria's collapse happened with the same elegance that characterized everything she did. One moment she was standing, champagne glass in hand, and the next, she was sinking to the marble tiles like a dancer in a final bow. The string quartet's music stuttered to a stop as several guests rushed forward. James reached her first, cradling her head as their personal physician, Dr. Mitchell, who had been among the guests, pushed through the crowd. Thomas stood frozen. Nearby, his birthday crown slightly askew, watching with wide eyes as the doctor checked his mother's vital signs. "Let's move her inside," Dr. Mitchell said quietly, his voice calm but authoritative. "And please, give us some space." The next few hours passed in a blur of discreet medical examinations and hushed conversations. The party disbanded naturally, guests making graceful exits with practiced concern. The media team was professionally dismissed, their footage carefully reviewed before they left. In the master bedroom, Victoria lay unconscious while various tests were conducted. James paced the adjoining sitting room, his mind racing through possibilities. He kept returning to Thomas's words, to that moment of hesitation in Victoria's eyes when they'd switched glasses. "Mr. Harrison?" Dr. Mitchell emerged from the bedroom, his expression puzzled. "All the preliminary tests have come back negative. No obvious substances in her system. No clear medical cause for the collapse. Her vitals are stable, but what?" James pressed, studying the doctor's face. "It's unusual. There's no medical explanation for her continued unconsciousness. We'll run more tests tomorrow, but for now, we'll monitor her condition. After." The medical team left. James sat in the dimly lit room, watching Victoria's chest rise and fall with steady breaths. The mansion felt different now, darker, filled with shadows he'd never noticed before. Every creak of the old house made him tense. He found himself studying his wife's face, searching for answers. Victoria had always been his anchor, his partner in everything from raising Thomas to building their healthcare empire. The idea that she might have tried to... He couldn't even complete the thought. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Chen, Thomas's nanny since birth, stood in the doorway with the boy in his pajamas. "He wanted to say goodnight," she said softly, her kind eyes filled with concern. Thomas padded across the room and climbed onto the bed beside his mother. He touched her hand gently, then looked at his father with those piercing blue eyes. "Is Mommy sick like Grandma was?" he asked. The question hit James like a physical blow. "No, buddy. Mommy's just very tired. She'll be better tomorrow." "Mrs." Chen gently led Thomas away, leaving James alone with his thoughts and the steady beeping of the medical monitors. He pulled out his phone and began reviewing the security footage from the party, focusing on the moments before Thomas had spoken to him. The camera angles were perfect. Victoria had made sure of that when they'd installed the system. But there were occasional splits in the footage, brief moments of static that shouldn't have been there. James frowned, making notes of the timestamps. As dawn approached, he found himself in his study, surrounded by medical reports and security logs. Something caught his eye. A receipt for medications he'd never prescribed, filed under his name. The date was from 3 weeks ago. The sound of movement from upstairs made him look up. Victoria was awake, asking for water. James hurried to her side, watching as she took small sips from the glass he offered. "What happened?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "You collapsed at the party," he replied, studying her face carefully. "What's the last thing you remember?" Victoria's brow furrowed. "The toast, I think. Everything after that is blank." James nodded slowly, noting how she avoided his gaze. Outside, the garden was still littered with evidence of the celebration. Fallen streamers, empty glasses, a child's party favor dropped in haste. But inside, in the growing morning light, something far more significant had been lost: trust. In the days following Victoria's collapse, the Harrison mansion began to feel like a different place to James. The familiar corridors and rooms that had witnessed countless family moments now held an undercurrent of tension. Every shadow seemed longer, every silence loaded with unspoken questions. James noticed small things first. His business notebook, filled with expansion plans for the Prevention Health Institute, wasn't where he'd left it in his study. The sized old album containing Thomas's childhood drawings had vanished from its usual spot on the library shelf. Most disturbing of all, he couldn't find the last letter his mother had written him before her illness, a document he'd always kept locked in his desk drawer. The security system, which Victoria had insisted on upgrading just months ago, showed peculiar gaps in its coverage. Brief moments of static, always occurring when James was alone in various parts of the house. He'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of his eye, only to turn and find empty rooms. One morning, while reviewing his calendar, he discovered appointments he never remembered making. Medical consultations, psychiatric evaluations, all scheduled under his name. When he called the offices to inquire, they confirmed the bookings had been made through proper channels, with all his correct information. "Mr. Harrison?" Mrs. Chen's voice interrupted his thoughts. She stood in the doorway of his study, her usually calm demeanor showing signs of worry. "Thomas is asking for you. He's been different since the party." James found his son in the playroom, surrounded by papers, covered in unusual drawings. Instead of the typical childhood artwork, these were complex diagrams, organizational charts, flow patterns, and what looked like business structures. Thomas quickly gathered them up when he saw his father, but not before James caught glimpses of familiar names from the Institute. "What are you working on, buddy?" James asked, keeping his voice casual. Thomas glanced toward the door before answering, as if checking for someone. "I'm trying to understand how everything works, Dad. How decisions are made." "What kind of decisions?" "About the company. About us." Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. "About you." Before James could probe further, Victoria appeared in the doorway. Thomas's demeanor changed instantly. The papers disappeared into his desk drawer, and his expression became carefully neutral. It was like watching a mask slide into place. "There's my brilliant boy," Victoria smiled, but James noticed how Thomas's shoulders tensed. "Ready for your piano lesson?" After they left, James found himself drawn to Thomas's desk. The drawings revealed a level of understanding that seemed impossible for an 8-year-old. Names of board members, investment structures, even security protocols, all mapped out in a child's handwriting. That evening, James discovered something else. Hidden in Victoria's closet behind designer shoeboxes, he found prescription, bottles with his name on them, anxiety medication, mood stabilizers. The dates matched the mysterious medical appointments in his calendar. When confronted, Victoria's response was measured, her Harvard-trained legal mind evident in every word. "You've been under immense pressure, James. The expansion plans, the board meetings, Thomas's future. I've seen how it's affecting you. I only wanted to help you rest, to think more clearly." "By medicating me without my knowledge?" James kept his voice low, aware of Thomas sleeping down the hall. "By protecting you from yourself," Victoria replied, her blue eyes, the same ones Thomas had inherited, filled with what looked like genuine concern. "You're not seeing things clearly anymore. Like how I'm not seeing my missing notebook or my mother's letter, or the gaps in our security footage." A flash of something, surprise, fear, crossed Victoria's face before she composed herself. "You're proving my point, James. Listen to yourself. These paranoid thoughts." But James was already walking away, his mind racing. He needed perspective, someone outside their immediate circle, someone who could see the situation clearly. The next morning, he made a call to Sarah Martinez, a former security specialist who had helped establish the Institute's internal protocols years ago. Now retired, she had always been someone he could trust for unvarnished truth. They met in a quiet cafe across town. Sarah listened without interruption as James detailed the recent events, the party, the missing items, the security anomalies, Thomas's strange behavior, the hidden medications. When he finished, Sarah sat in silence for a long moment, her experienced eyes studying him carefully. Finally, she spoke, her words measured and deliberate. "If someone's trying to erase you, James, it's not about money. It's about control. And maybe it's not your wife. Or maybe it is." The words followed James home, echoing in his mind as he walked through his front door. The house was quiet. Victoria had taken Thomas to his swimming lesson. In the stillness, James noticed something new. The family photos lining the hallway seemed different somehow. He looked closer and realized some had been replaced with nearly identical versions. But in these, he appeared slightly different. More tired, more unstable. James spent the next week methodically installing microscopic cameras throughout the main areas of the house. He wasn't looking for dramatic revelations. He wanted truth. He needed to understand what happened in the spaces between his presence, in the moments when he wasn't watching. The footage revealed patterns he might have missed otherwise. How Victoria's phone calls always ended when he entered a room. The way she studied him when she thought he wasn't looking, taking notes in a small black book he'd never seen before. Most disturbing were her conversations with Thomas, careful, measured discussions that seemed designed to shape the boy's perceptions. One evening, while reviewing the day's recordings, James caught a conversation that made his blood run cold. Victoria was on the phone in the garden, pacing between the rose bushes she'd planted when they first moved in. "He's getting worse," she was saying, her voice tight with what sounded like concern. "If he continues like this, he'll destroy himself. Maybe he needs to fall to understand." There was a pause as she listened to the person on the other end. "Yes, I've documented everything. The doctors agree with the assessment." James watched the footage 3 times, trying to understand the layers of meaning in her words. Was she talking about him? What kind of fall was she anticipating? The clinical way she discussed his supposed deterioration sent chills down his spine. His investigation took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Chen was suddenly dismissed. Victoria had made the decision unilaterally, citing concerns about inappropriate attachments and boundary issues. The nanny who had been with them since Thomas's birth was gone within hours, all her personal belongings packed and removed, while James was at a board meeting. It took James 3 days to track down Mrs. Chen's new contact information. When he finally reached her, all she would say was, "I saw things I shouldn't have. You need to open your eyes, Mr. Harrison. Please, for Thomas's sake." The mention of his son's name sparked a new wave of worry. James began paying closer attention to Thomas's behavior, noting how the boy seemed to operate in 2 distinct modes. When Victoria was present, he was quiet, agreeable, almost performing a role. But in the rare moments they were alone, Thomas's questions became probing, specific, focused on the Institute's operations and decision-making processes. "Dad?" Thomas asked one afternoon while they were supposedly working on his science project. "Who makes the final decisions about the new research labs?" "The board does, buddy. Why do you ask?" "But you're the founder. Shouldn't you decide?" Thomas's eyes held a knowledge that seemed far beyond his years. "Mum says sometimes people try to take control from the ones who built things." Before James could respond, Victoria appeared in the doorway. Thomas immediately began talking about his science project, the previous conversation disappearing as if it had never happened. Later that night, James found himself in his study, surrounded by security footage and medical records. He discovered something that made his hands shake: a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, complete with diagnoses of exhaustion and paranoid tendencies. It was signed by Dr. Mitchell, the same physician who had attended to Victoria at the party. The documents painted a picture of a man losing his grip on reality, seeing conspiracies where there were none, unable to distinguish between real threats and imagined ones. Everything was meticulously documented, professionally presented, and utterly convincing. If you didn't know, it was built on half-truths and manipulated evidence. A soft noise at the door made him look up. Thomas stood there in his pajamas, clutching a folder to his chest. "I need to show you something, Dad," he whispered, glancing nervously down the hall. "But you can't tell Mom." Inside the folder were drawings, dozens of them. But these weren't the organizational charts James had seen before. These were pictures of him, of Victoria, of their family. each one annotated with dates and observations in Thomas's careful handwriting. Next to some of the images were question marks, and beside others, small exclamation points that seemed to carry urgent warnings. The confrontation at the staircase began with a simple question about Thomas's art class. James and Victoria stood at opposite ends of the grand hallway, their voices echoing off the marble floors in what started as a casual conversation about their son's newest hobby. "He's been drawing some interesting things lately," James said, watching Victoria's reaction carefully, particularly about the institute's structure. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her tablet. "He's a curious child, James. He wants to understand what his parents do. Curious enough to document board meetings he's never attended, to draw security, protocols he shouldn't know about." The tension in the air thickened as they moved toward the sweeping staircase, its polished wooden handrail gleaming in the afternoon light, filtering through the tall windows. "You're reading too much into children's drawings." Victoria's voice remained calm, measured. "This obsession with hidden meanings, James, it's exactly what Dr. Mitchell warned about." "Dr. Mitchell," James let out a bitter laugh. "The same doctor who conveniently found nothing wrong when you collapsed at the party. The one signing prescriptions in my name." Victoria took a step up the stairs, looking down at him with what appeared to be genuine concern. "You're not well. James, you haven't been for months. The stress of the expansion, the pressure you put on yourself." "Stop." James moved closer to the stairs. "Stop trying to make me doubt myself. The missing files, the changed photographs, the security footage, all explained if you'd just listen to reason." Victoria interrupted. "Files get misplaced, photos get updated, security systems have glitches, but you're creating conspiracies out of coincidences." Their voices had risen slightly, bouncing off the high ceilings. Neither noticed Thomas at the top of the stairs, watching silently, his blue eyes moving between his parents like he was tracking a tennis match. "Coincidences?" James started up the stairs. "Like Mrs. Chen's sudden dismissal? Like the psychiatric evaluations I never attended? Like the medications hidden in your closet?" He was halfway up when it happened. His foot caught on something, or did it? The handrail seemed to give way under his grip. Or was it his imagination? The world tilted sideways as he lost his balance, tumbling backward down several steps before everything went black. When James regained consciousness, he was lying in the hospital wing of his own institute, surrounded by the soft beeping of medical monitors. Dr. Mitchell stood at his bedside, reviewing charts with Victoria. "Just a mild concussion," the doctor was saying, "but given the circumstances and his recent episodes, we should keep him under observation." James tried to focus his blurry vision on the handrail that had failed him. Had it really been loose? Or was his mind playing tricks on him, just as Victoria and Dr. Mitchell suggested? Through the haze of pain medication, he caught fragments of conversations in the hallway. Victoria's voice, professional and controlled. "Escalating paranoid. Behavior, safety concerns. Need to consider all options." Later that evening, when the nurses had left and Victoria had gone home to put Thomas to bed, James received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Martinez slipped into his room, her expression grave. "I've been doing some digging," she whispered, glancing at the door. "The security footage from your staircase. It's been altered professionally, the kind of work that requires serious expertise." James struggled to sit up. "Victoria?" "Not directly," Sarah replied. "But I traced the work to a firm that specializes in digital manipulation. They've done work for your institute before, specifically for projects Victoria oversaw." Before she could say more, footsteps approached the room. Sarah disappeared as quietly as she had come, leaving James with more questions than answers. The next morning, Thomas snuck into the hospital wing before school. He climbed onto James's bed, his small face serious. "Dad," he whispered, pulling something from his backpack. "I saw what happened on the stairs. I was drawing it." He handed over a folded piece of paper. The drawing showed the staircase in remarkable detail, including a figure reaching up to adjust something on the handrail early that morning. The figure wore Victoria's favorite pearl necklace. "Mom said you fell because you're tired," Thomas continued, his voice barely audible. "But I saw—" The door opened and Victoria entered with Dr. Mitchell. Thomas quickly grabbed back the drawing, stuffing it into his pocket. His face transformed into a mask of casual cheerfulness. "Good morning, darling," Victoria smiled, but her eyes lingered on the pocket where Thomas had hidden the drawing. "Shouldn't you be getting ready for school?" After being released from the hospital, James found himself drawn to the guest room, a space that had always seemed oddly off-limits. Victoria kept it meticulously clean, citing its occasional use for visiting board members, but something about her insistence on maintaining it personally had always struck him as unusual. While Victoria was attending a board meeting and Thomas was at his piano lesson, James conducted a thorough search of the room. Behind the antique dresser, he discovered a loose panel in the wall. Inside was a second phone, one he'd never seen before. The device was sophisticated, with multiple layers of security, but Victoria had always used the same variations of passwords, and after several attempts, James gained access. What he found made his hands tremble. Messages exchanged with a child psychologist revealed a carefully constructed plan. The conversations spanned months, discussing ways to prepare Thomas emotionally for necessary changes and manage the transition of authority. "The boy shows remarkable resilience," one message read, "but we need to ensure he understands these steps are for his father's own good. The Institute's future cannot be compromised by one man's deterioration." Another thread of messages focused on James himself. "Patient continues to display concerning behaviors. Increasing isolation, paranoid tendencies. The medication program should help stabilize him, but we must be prepared for resistance." James photographed everything with his own phone, his mind racing. The evidence was clear, but the motivation remained murky. Why go to such lengths? What was the ultimate goal? A file labeled Thomas Progress Notes caught his attention. Inside were detailed observations of his son's behavior, emotional responses, and psychological development. But these weren't just medical notes. They read more like performance evaluations. Subject demonstrates advanced pattern recognition and strategic thinking. His ability to maintain dual personas, compliant child with mother, inquisitive protege with father, shows remarkable adaptability. Recommended for accelerated program pending father's removal from operational control. This EC. Word removal sent a chill down James's spine. He scrolled through more messages, finding conversations with various specialists, psychiatrists, legal consultants, even public relations experts, all focused on managing what they referred to as the transition. A new message notification popped up on the screen. Meeting confirmed with legal team. Documents prepared for emergency conservatorship hearing. All medical evaluations support the necessity of immediate intervention. James heard footsteps in the hallway. Quickly, he replaced the phone exactly as he'd found it and moved the panel back into place. He had barely straightened the dresser when Victoria appeared in the doorway. "James, what are you doing in here?" Her voice was casual, but her eyes scanned the room rapidly. "Just looking for some old files," he replied, matching her tone. "Thomas mentioned wanting to see pictures from when we started the Institute." Victoria's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "How sweet, but you know we keep those in the library." Speaking of Thomas, Dr. Carter would like to schedule another session with him. "Dr. Carter?" James kept his face neutral, recognizing the name from the messages. "I didn't realize Thomas was seeing a therapist." "Just for general emotional support," Victoria explained smoothly. "With everything that's been happening, I thought it would be good for him to have someone to talk to. You understand, don't you?" James nodded, even as his mind raced with the implications. Dr. Carter, the same psychologist from the messages, the one helping to prepare Thomas for whatever was coming. Later that evening, James found Thomas in the library, surrounded by his usual array of drawings, but these were different. Architectural plans of the institute, security layouts, emergency protocols, things an 8-year-old shouldn't know. "Dad," Thomas whispered, looking around before pulling out a particular drawing. "I found something in Mom's office, but she doesn't know I can read cursive yet." The drawing was a recreation of a legal document, precise enough that James could make out the words transfer of authority and medical necessity. In the corner, Thomas had written a question: "Why does Mom want to change who's in charge?" Before James could respond, Victoria's voice called from downstairs. Thomas quickly hid the drawing and pulled out a decoy, a simple childhood drawing of their family, but James noticed how the figures were positioned, himself slightly apart. Victoria standing protectively over Thomas, and in the background, shadowy figures watching it all unfold. James spent the next few days carefully documenting everything he found, creating a secure digital trail of evidence. But his most startling discovery came from an unexpected source: the Institute's legal department. In a sealed envelope marked confidential, he found transfer documents for company shares, all structured to move ownership to Thomas's name through a complex series of trusts. The paperwork had been prepared by Andrew Blackwood, a corporate lawyer who had recently joined the Institute's legal team. James remembered Victoria mentioning dinner meetings with Blackwood, casual references to restructuring discussions that he'd dismissed as routine business matters. The documents told a different story. They outlined a comprehensive plan to transfer controlling interest to Thomas, with Victoria acting as trustee until he reached maturity. Every detail had been meticulously planned, every contingency considered. The only thing missing was James's signature, or proof of his incapacity to make business decisions. In his private office at the Institute, James spread out the papers across his desk, trying to piece together the larger picture. The transfer documents connected to the psychiatric evaluations, which linked to the medication records, creating a web of carefully orchestrated events. A knock at his door made him quickly gather the papers. Sarah Martinez entered, her expression tense. "I found something," she said without preamble. "The security firm Victoria hired last month? They don't just do surveillance. They specialize in creating alternate realities, digital manipulation, staged evidence, the works." James leaned back in his chair, the implications hitting him hard. "The security footage gaps are intentional," Sarah finished. "They're creating spaces where things can happen without record, but there's more. They're also experts at behavioral manipulation through environmental control." "What do you mean?" "Small changes in familiar spaces, moving items, altering photographs, creating doubt in someone's mind about their own memories and perceptions. It's sophisticated psychological work." The conversation was interrupted by James's phone buzzing with a message from Thomas. "Dad, please come home. Something's wrong with my art room." James found Thomas in his private art studio, a converted sunroom that had always been his safe space. The room had been subtly altered. Drawings rearranged, furniture slightly moved, even the lighting seemed different. "They changed it while I was at school," Thomas whispered, his small hands clutching a sketchbook. "Mom says I did it myself, that I'm forgetting things like you do. But I'm not, Dad, I remember everything." James knelt beside his son, noting how Thomas's eyes constantly darted to the doorway. "What do you remember, buddy?" "The way things were before. The real pictures, not the ones they put up. The conversations they don't want you to know about." Thomas opened his sketchbook to a new drawing, a detailed map of the Institute's executive floor, with red marks indicating camera locations and what he called watching spots. "Mom has people watching you, Dad. They write down everything." "You do? They have meetings about you in the blue room, the one they say is always locked for renovations." The sound of heels on hardwood made them both look up. Victoria stood in the doorway, elegant as always in her designer suit. "Thomas, darling, you're late for your session with Dr. Carter." "But Mom, my art class has been rescheduled," Victoria finished smoothly. "Dr. Carter feels these sessions are very important right now. With all the changes happening, we need to make sure you're processing everything properly." James watched as Thomas's demeanor shifted, the familiar mask sliding into place. The boy carefully closed his sketchbook, but not before James caught a glimpse of another drawing. This one showing a series of rooms at the institute he'd never seen before, marked with the words Special Research and Behavior Modification. After Thomas left with Victoria, James returned to his office, his mind racing. He began a systematic review of the institute's architectural plans, looking for these mysterious rooms. What he found made his blood run cold. An entire section of the research wing, officially listed as storage and maintenance, had been quietly renovated 6 months ago under Victoria's direct supervision. A notification popped up on his computer, a calendar invite for a board meeting he hadn't scheduled, with an attached agenda that made his heart skip. Emergency Executive Review, discussion of leadership transition and medical contingency measures. The conference room was filled with familiar faces that suddenly seemed foreign to James. Board members he'd worked with for years now watched him with careful, evaluating eyes. Victoria sat at her usual place beside him, her posture perfect, her expression concerned and professional. Dr. Mitchell stood at the front of the room, presenting a series of slides filled with medical terminology and behavioral assessments. The pattern of erratic behavior has become impossible to ignore, he was saying. The paranoid delusions, the obsessive documentation, the inappropriate investigations into secure areas of the facility. James looked around the table, noting how some board members nodded in agreement while others studied their tablets, avoiding eye contact. The evidence being presented was compelling, if you didn't know the full story. Mr. Harrison's dedication to this institute is unquestionable, Dr. Mitchell continued, his voice gentle with practiced sympathy. But his recent actions suggest a concerning decline in judgment. The stress of managing such a large organization, combined with unresolved trauma from his mother's illness, has created a perfect storm of psychological pressure. Victoria touched James's hand lightly, a gesture that would look supportive to observers, but felt like a warning. Perhaps we should take a break, she suggested. This is a lot to process. No, James said firmly. Please continue. I'm very interested in hearing everything. The next hour was a masterclass in character assassination through concern. Every recent business decision he'd made was reframed as evidence of instability. His questions about missing files became paranoid obsessions. His investigation into the security system was presented as dangerous interference with institute operations. But James had come prepared. While Dr. Mitchell talked about the need for temporary leadership adjustments, James quietly connected his laptop to the room's display system. He noticed Victoria tense beside him, her fingers tightening around her pen. Before we continue, James interrupted, I'd like to share some relevant information. With a click, he brought up the first document, the transfer papers he'd discovered, complete with timestamps and authorization codes. These were prepared 3 months ago, he said calmly, before any of my supposed symptoms began. Interesting timing, wouldn't you say? He moved through his evidence methodically, the hidden medication records, the manipulated security footage, the architectural plans for the mysterious research wing. With each revelation, he watched the board members' expressions shift from concern to confusion to growing alarm. And then there's this, James said, pulling out a final file. Documentation of an experimental behavioral modification program designed to create controllable successors in family-owned companies. A program that requires extensive psychological conditioning of both the current leadership and their potential heirs. Victoria's calm facade cracked slightly. James, you're not well. This paranoid fantasy you've constructed is supported by evidence, a new voice interrupted. Sarah Martinez stepped into the room, followed by 2 members of the Institute's Internal Audit Committee. We've verified everything Mr. Harrison has presented. The program exists, and it's been in operation here for months. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Board members demanded explanations. Dr. Mitchell attempted to intervene, but was silenced by the Audit Committee's preliminary findings. Victoria sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. But it was Thomas who delivered the final blow. He appeared, at the conference room door, clutching his sketchbook. "I can show you everything," he said, his voice small but clear. "All the rooms, all the meetings, all the plans, I drew them all." One by one, Thomas laid out his drawings on the conference table, detailed, dated illustrations of secret meetings, hidden facilities, and conversations that should never have been witnessed by a child's eyes. Each picture was accompanied by notes in his careful handwriting, documenting times, dates, and participants. "Mom said it was to protect Dad," Thomas explained, looking directly at the board members. "She said sometimes people need to be saved from themselves, but I saw what they were really doing in those special rooms. I heard what they planned for other families, other companies." In the aftermath of the board meeting, the Institute was thrown into carefully controlled chaos. The audit committee launched a full investigation into the behavioral modification program, uncovering layers of deception that went far beyond the Harrison family. James sat in his home office reviewing the preliminary findings. The program had been designed to identify and prepare potential successors in powerful families, using sophisticated psychological techniques to shape both the current leaders and their heirs. Thomas had been just one of several children being groomed for future control. "You have to understand," Victoria said from the doorway, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "We were trying to create something revolutionary, a way to ensure stable transitions of power, to prevent the kind of chaos that destroys family legacies." James looked up at his wife, seeing her clearly for the first time in months. The brilliant, legal mind, the strategic thinker, the woman who had helped him build an empire, all of it now cast in a different light. By manipulating children, by gaslighting their parents, he gestured to the files spread across his desk. These psychological profiles, the medication protocols, the behavior modification sessions, this goes beyond stable transitions, Victoria. "We were building a better future," she insisted. "Think about it, James. How many family businesses collapse because the next generation isn't properly prepared? How many legacies are lost because of emotional attachments and irrational decisions? And Thomas, was he just another test subject to you?" Victoria's composure wavered slightly. "He was meant to be the prototype, the perfect successor. His intelligence, his adaptability, he was ideal. For the program, I was protecting his future. By turning him into a spy against his own father? By teaching him to see clearly?" Victoria's careful control cracked. "You were so focused on your mother's legacy, on building these clinics, that you couldn't see what Thomas really needed. The program wasn't just about control. It was about creating leaders who could think beyond emotional ties." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of piano music floating up from downstairs. Thomas was playing, not his usual practice. Pieces, but something more complex, more emotional. "He started composing after the program began," Victoria said softly. "The psychological conditioning enhanced his creative abilities, his pattern recognition. We were helping him reach his full potential." James stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the garden where they had celebrated Thomas's birthday, just months ago. "And the other children? The ones whose files we found?" "All exceptional candidates, children from influential families, each with the potential to reshape their family enterprises. The program was designed to turn them into perfect little corporate soldiers," James interrupted, "trained to prioritize business over human connection." Victoria's silence was telling. James turned to face her, noting how she stood perfectly, still her legal training evident in her controlled posture. "The board wants to meet again tomorrow," she finally said. "They'll want to know everything, about the program, about the other families involved, about the research we've been conducting. Research that involved manipulating children's minds, Victoria. Experiments in psychological control disguised as corporate succession planning. We were creating a new paradigm of leadership," she maintained. "These children would have grown up to run their family enterprises with clarity, without the burden of emotional entanglements." The piano music downstairs changed, becoming something darker, more complicated. James recognized it as a piece Thomas had been working on during the height of the program's influence. "Listen to him," Victoria said. "That complexity, that understanding of emotional dynamics, It's all because of what we taught him. The program worked, James. It just worked differently than we expected. James walked to his desk and picked up one of Thomas's drawings, a detailed diagram of the program's psychological conditioning techniques, rendered in a child's hand, but with disturbing precision. "No," he said quietly. "It worked exactly as designed. It turned our son into an observer of his own life, taught him to document and analyze instead of feel and connect. But you forgot something crucial, Victoria." "What's that?" "You can't program human nature out of people. Thomas didn't just observe, he understood, and he chose to use that understanding to expose the truth, not conceal it." The evening of Thomas's piano recital arrived with an undercurrent of tension. The Institute's auditorium was filled with board members, researchers, and families involved in the program, all gathered under the pretense of a children's musical showcase. Thomas sat at the grand piano, his small figure almost dwarfed by the instrument. But when he began to play, the power of his performance filled the space. The piece was his own composition, something he'd been working on throughout the tumultuous months of discovery and revelation. James watched from the front row, hearing in the music everything his son had witnessed. The complex harmonies spoke of hidden meetings and whispered conversations. The dramatic shifts in tone reflected the dual nature of their household, the perfect family image versus the darker reality beneath. Victoria sat separately, surrounded by her legal team. The investigation had revealed her role as not just a participant, but a key architect of the program. Her Harvard law background had been instrumental in creating the legal framework that protected their experiments in behavioral modification. As Thomas played, James noticed other children in the audience, the ones he'd identified from the program files. They sat with their families, their faces showing a recognition of the story being told through the music. Like Thomas, they had been chosen for their exceptional abilities, their potential to be molded into perfect successors. The composition reached a crescendo, and Thomas introduced a new theme, something hopeful emerging from the complexity. James recognized it as the melody he used to hum while working in his study before all of this began. The audience stirred, feeling the emotional shift in the music. In the back of the auditorium, Sarah Martinez stood with members of the audit committee, their presence a reminder of the ongoing investigation. The program's full scope was still being uncovered, a network of influence, extending through multiple prestigious families, all manipulated under the guise of corporate succession planning. Thomas's fingers moved across the keys with remarkable precision, each note carrying meaning beyond the music. This wasn't just a performance, it was testimony. Through his composition, he was telling the story that his drawings had begun, revealing how the program had tried to reshape young minds while destroying family bonds. The piece ended with a series of questioning notes, left unresolved. The audience sat in stunned silence before erupting in applause. Thomas stood and bowed, his eyes finding his father's in the crowd. As people began to leave, James overheard fragments of conversations, board members discussing the program's implications, parents recognizing similar patterns in their own families, researchers debating the ethics of psychological conditioning in corporate succession. Victoria approached them as Thomas packed up his sheet music. "That was beautiful, darling," she said, her voice carrying its usual polish. "Your understanding of emotional complexity has grown remarkably." "It's not complexity, Mom," Thomas replied, looking up at her with those piercing blue eyes. "It's just truth. The program taught me to see patterns, but it didn't teach me what to do with them. I figured that out myself." James watched this exchange, noting how Victoria's careful composure flickered at their son's words. The program had indeed enhanced Thomas's abilities, but not in the way they had intended. Instead of creating a controllable successor, they had nurtured an observer who chose to expose rather than perpetuate the cycle of manipulation. Later that evening, as they drove home, Thomas spoke quietly from the back seat. "Dad, I have one more drawing to show you. It's different from the others." At home, in the safety of his art room, Thomas revealed his final illustration. Unlike his previous detailed diagrams and observations, this was a simple family portrait. But instead of the posed perfection of their usual photographs, it showed them as they really were, complex, flawed, human. The program wanted me to see people as pieces to move around, Thomas explained, pointing to the drawing. But I learned to see them as they are instead. Even when the truth is complicated, the Prevention Health Institute's main lobby had never felt so different to James. As he walked through the familiar space with Thomas beside him, he noticed how employees watched them, not with their usual deference, but with a mix of curiosity and concern. The news of the behavioral modification program had spread through the organization like ripples in a pond, touching every department and changing the Institute's carefully crafted image. "Dad," Thomas said, stopping by the wall, "of founder photographs, they changed your picture again." He pointed to James's portrait, and indeed the image had been subtly altered, this time back to its original version, showing James as he truly was, not the manipulated version that had appeared during Victoria's campaign to undermine him. The Institute's board had called an emergency session to address the fallout from the program's exposure. James and Thomas were scheduled to speak to help the board understand the full impact of what had happened. Victoria would attend separately with her legal team. As they waited in the conference room, Thomas pulled out his sketchbook. "I want to show them something," he said, flipping to a new drawing. Unlike his previous diagnostic illustrations, this one showed the Institute as it could be, a place of genuine healing and prevention, not psychological manipulation. The board members filed in, their usual confident demeanors subdued. Dr. Mitchell was notably absent, having been suspended pending investigation. Sarah Martinez sat in his usual place, her presence a symbol of the Institute's commitment to transparency. "Before we begin," James addressed the room, "I want everyone to understand something. This isn't about assigning blame, it's about acknowledging what happened and ensuring it never happens again." Thomas stood beside his father, spreading out a series of drawings on the conference table. "These show how the program worked," he explained, his young voice steady. "How they watched us, tested us, tried to change how we think. But they also show something else." The board members leaned forward as Thomas revealed his newest illustrations, detailed plans for transforming the program's research facilities into genuine therapeutic spaces. "We can help people here," Thomas continued, "really help them, not try to control them." One of the senior board members, an elderly woman who had known James's mother, spoke up. "The Institute was founded to prevent suffering, not cause it. We lost sight of that somewhere along the way." James watched as his son guided the board through his vision for the Institute's future. Thomas had taken the observational skills the program had tried to instill and turned them toward healing instead of manipulation. His drawing showed recovery rooms where there had been conditioning chambers, family counseling spaces where psychological programming had once occurred. "Your mother," James said quietly to Thomas during a break in the presentation, "she believed she was protecting your future. The program twisted that instinct into something else." Thomas nodded, adding final touches to a new sketch. "I know, Dad. That's why I drew this." He revealed an illustration of Victoria, not as the polished corporate figure she presented to the world, but as the mother he remembered from earlier years, reading him stories, teaching him to play piano, laughing in the garden. The board meeting continued into the afternoon, with decisions being made about the Institute's new direction. The behavioral modification program would be completely dismantled, its research secured for evidence. But more importantly, the Institute would return to its original mission, preventing suffering through genuine care and support. As they left the conference room, James noticed a group of parents and children in the waiting area. Other families affected by the program. They had come seeking answers, understanding, and a way forward. Thomas approached them without hesitation, his sketchbook in hand. "I can show you what happened," he told them, "but I can also show you how we can make it better." The families gathered around as Thomas shared his drawings, both the dark ones, documenting the program, and the hopeful ones showing a different future. James watched his son become not the controlled successor Victoria had envisioned, but something far more valuable, a bridge between understanding and healing. Later, that evening, as they walked through the Institute's gardens, Thomas stopped by a newly planted section. "Mom used to say that sometimes things need to break before they can grow properly," he said, touching a young sapling. "I don't think she meant it the way it happened, but maybe she was right anyway." James looked at his son, seeing not the project the program had tried to create, but the remarkably resilient child who had emerged from it. "What do you want to do with the old research wing?" he asked. Thomas pulled out his sketchbook, revealing a detailed plan. "I want to make it a place where families can heal together," he said, "where they can learn to see each other clearly, without anyone trying to change who they are." The Harrison mansion felt different now, its spaces slowly being reclaimed from the shadow of manipulation and control. James and Thomas had begun the process of healing, room by room, memory by memory. The security cameras had been removed, the hidden monitoring devices discovered and dismantled. But more importantly, they were learning to trust their own perceptions again. In Thomas's art room, now restored to its original layout, father and son sat surrounded by drawings. Some documented the program's influence, others showed the path to recovery. But today they were creating something new together, a family portrait unlike any that had hung in their halls before. "She wasn't always like that," Thomas said, carefully adding details to Victoria's figure in the drawing. "The program changed her too, didn't it?" James watched his son work, amazed at how he could capture emotion and truth with such simple lines. "Yes, it did." The Institute's mission of prevention spoke to her deeply, but somewhere along the way, prevention became control. The portrait they were creating showed all three of them. James with his protective stance but open smile, Thomas with his observant eyes and creative spirit, and Victoria, not as the polished corporate figure or the manipulative program director, but as the complex person she truly was. "Dr. Carter says I don't need special sessions anymore," Thomas mentioned, adding shading to the drawing. "She says I can just come to regular therapy, to talk about normal things, like how I feel about Mom being away." Victoria had voluntarily stepped back from both the family and the Institute, choosing to undergo therapy herself while the investigation continued. Her absence was felt in every room of the house, but particularly in the spaces where her influence had been strongest. The pristine guest room that had hidden her second phone, the study where she had planned the program's implementation. As Guy, they worked on the portrait. Other families affected by the program began to reach out. Parents seeking understanding, children who had been through similar experiences. Thomas's art room became a kind of sanctuary, where his drawings helped others make sense of what had happened to them. "Dad," Thomas said, pausing in his work, "I want to show this at school. Not just this drawing, but all of them. The ones about the program, about what happened, about how we're fixing it. Miss Anderson says it might help other kids who have big feelings they don't understand." James looked at his son, seeing not the perfect successor Victoria had tried to create, but the empathetic, insightful child who had emerged despite, or perhaps because of, everything they had experienced. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" he asked gently. Thomas nodded, adding final touches to the portrait. "The program taught me to watch and record everything, but you taught me what to do with what I saw. Sometimes the truth needs to be shared, so others can heal too." As they hung the new portrait in the family room, replacing one of the manipulated photographs that had been part of Victoria's campaign, James noticed something extraordinary in the drawing. Thomas had captured not just their physical likenesses, but the complex emotional journey they had undergone. In the background of the portrait, barely visible but intentionally included, were glimpses of their story, the security cameras, the hidden documents, the medicinal bottles, but they were shown as fading elements, while the foreground highlighted the stronger bonds that had emerged from the crisis. The doorbell rang, and Thomas tensed momentarily, a remnant of the hypervigilance the program had instilled. But it was Sarah Martinez bringing news from the Institute. She paused when she saw the portrait, understanding immediately what it represented. "The board has approved all the changes," she announced. The old program facilities will be converted into family therapy centers, just like Thomas suggested. And, she hesitated, looking at Thomas, your mother has agreed to provide a full statement about how the program was developed. She wants to help make things right. Thomas added one final detail to the portrait, a small piano in the corner, with sheet music visible on the stand. The composition he had played at the recital, now published and being used in music therapy sessions at the Institute. People keep asking me if I'm angry, Thomas said, stepping back to view their completed work. But I'm not. I'm just glad we can see each other clearly now, all of us. James put his arm around his son's shoulders, both of them contemplating the portrait that told their story. Not of perfect succession or controlled legacy, but of human complexity, resilience, and the courage to face truth with compassion. Chapter. Elementary school auditorium buzzed with nervous energy as Thomas set up his presentation. The walls were lined with his drawings, carefully arranged to tell a story of transformation. Parents, teachers, and students filed in, some aware of the context, others simply curious about the young artist's work. Miss Anderson, Thomas's art teacher, helped him arrange the final pieces. Remember, she said gently, you only need to share what you feel comfortable sharing. But Thomas had already decided to tell the whole story. His drawings, once tools of documentation and survival, had become instruments of healing. The exhibition began with simple family portraits from before the program, progressing through the subtle changes that had occurred during Victoria's implementation of the behavioral modification scheme. My mum thought she was protecting our future, Thomas explained to the gathered audience, his voice clear and steady. She wanted to make sure family businesses stayed strong, that children were ready to take over when the time came. But somewhere along the way, protection turned into something else. James stood at the back of the auditorium watching his son guide people through the exhibition. Each drawing revealed another layer of their experience. The security cameras hidden in everyday objects, the subtle alterations to family photographs, the secret meetings documented in a child's precise hand. The program taught us to observe everything, Thomas continued, moving to a series of more complex drawings. To analyze patterns, to understand systems. They thought they were creating perfect successors, but they didn't realize that understanding doesn't always lead to control. Several parents in the audience shifted uncomfortably, recognizing patterns from their own corporate families. A few children moved closer to the drawings, pointing out details that resonated with their own experiences of pressure and expectation. But this isn't just about what happened, Thomas said, moving to the newer drawings. It's about what we're doing now. He revealed his designs for the Institute's transformation, the conversion of monitoring rooms into healing spaces, observation chambers into family counseling centers. Miss Anderson stepped forward, addressing the audience. Thomas's work shows us something important about resilience and truth. He took skills meant for one purpose and used them for healing instead. The presentation reached its centerpiece, the family portrait Thomas and James had created together. But now it was accompanied by a new series of drawings showing the Institute's journey from prevention through control to genuine healing. My dad built the Institute to prevent suffering, Thomas explained, standing beside the portrait. The program lost sight of that, but we're finding our way back, and we're doing it together. Parents began asking questions, not just about the art, but about the deeper implications of pressure placed on children in successful families. Thomas answered with remarkable clarity, his experiences transformed into wisdom beyond his years. The hardest part wasn't seeing what was happening, he told them. It was deciding what to do with what I saw. The program taught us to observe and record, but it was love that taught us to heal. James noticed several of his corporate colleagues in the audience, people who had considered enrolling their own children in the program. They watched Thomas with a mix of wonder and regret, seeing in his strength and clarity what might have been lost through psychological conditioning. After the formal presentation, Thomas led small groups through the exhibition, explaining specific pieces in more detail. He paused at a drawing of Victoria in her office, surrounded by program documents. "My mom is getting help now," he said quietly to a young girl who asked about the picture. "Sometimes people get lost trying to protect the things they love, but getting lost doesn't mean you can't find your way back." The school counselor approached James as the evening wound down. "We'd like to create a permanent installation of some of these pieces," she said. "They're opening up important conversations about pressure, expectations, and the courage to speak up." Thomas was carefully taking down the drawings when a small group of students approached him. They were children of other corporate leaders, kids who lived with similar pressures and expectations. "Could you teach us to draw like this?" one boy asked. "Not just the pictures, but how to show what's really happening." James watched as his son's face lit up with a new purpose. The skills the program had tried to instill for control were being transformed into tools for expression and understanding. The renovation of the Institute's research wing marked a physical transformation that matched the emotional one taking place within the Harrison family. Where there had once been observation rooms and behavioral modification chambers, now stood warm, welcoming spaces designed for genuine healing and connection. James walked through the newly renovated corridors with Thomas, watching as his son compared the reality to his original drawings. The architectural plans Thomas had sketched had been followed almost exactly, transforming the clinical spaces into something entirely new. "It's even better than I imagined," Thomas said, running his hand along a wall now decorated with therapeutic art pieces. "You can barely tell what it used to be." The former monitoring center had become a family art therapy room, its walls lined with supplies and comfortable seating. The security screens had been replaced with display spaces for healing artwork. In one corner stood an elegant piano, a reminder of how Thomas's music had helped break through the program's carefully constructed facades. "Mr. Harrison?" a familiar voice called from down the hall. Dr. Carter, now heading the Institute's new family therapy program, approached with a group of parents and children. "Would you and Thomas mind joining our first group session? Some of the families have questions about the transformation." The therapy room filled with people, each carrying their own story of corporate pressure and family expectations. Thomas set up his sketchbook at a central table, ready to share his experiences through art. "The program taught us to see patterns," he explained to the group, beginning a new drawing. "But it didn't tell us we could choose what to do with what we saw. That's something I learned from my dad." As Thomas worked, James noticed how the other children gravitated toward him, watching his precise lines take shape on the paper. These were the children who might have been next in line for the program, bright, observant kids from powerful families. "Your son," one parent said quietly to James, "he's helping our children understand things we couldn't explain to them." The drawing Thomas was creating showed the Institute as it now was, a place of genuine prevention and healing. But he didn't hide the history. Instead, he incorporated it, showing how understanding the past could lead to better choices in the future. A subtle movement at the door caught James's attention. Victoria stood there, hesitant to enter. This was her first visit since the program's exposure, part of her own therapy process. Thomas saw her too, and without pausing in his explanation to the group, added her figure to his drawing. Not as the program director she had been, but as the mother she was trying to become again. "Mom," Thomas called out softly, "we're showing how things have changed. Would you like to see?" Victoria stepped into the room, her usual corporate polish replaced by something more genuine, more vulnerable. The other parents made space for her at the table, many of them understanding the complex journey of realizing when protection becomes control. "I've been working with Dr. Carter," Victoria said, her voice carrying none of its old authority, "learning to see the difference between preparing children for the future and trying to control that future." Thomas pushed his sketchbook toward her, showing the transformation he had designed. "We kept some things," he explained. "The attention to detail, the understanding of patterns. We just use them differently now." The session continued, with families sharing their experiences of pressure and expectation. Thomas drew as they talked, creating visual representations of their stories and showing how they connected to the Institute's new mission. "The program taught us to document everything," Thomas told a young girl who was sharing her own story of family pressure. "But now we use that skill to understand and heal, not to control. James watched as his son, once intended to be the program's perfect prototype, instead became its most powerful antidote. Thomas had taken every tool the program had given him, observation, analysis, documentation, and transformed them into instruments of healing. Victoria remained quiet through most of the session, but her eyes never left Thomas as he worked. When he started a new drawing showing their family's journey, she reached out and touched the paper gently. "I thought I was protecting your future," she said softly. "I didn't realize I was risking the most important part of it, your ability to choose who you want to become." The evening sun cast long shadows through the Harrison mansion's windows as Thomas sat at his piano, fingers hovering over the keys. The instrument had become more than just a musical outlet. It was now a bridge between past and present, between control and freedom. Victoria sat in the family room, listening to their son practice. She had been attending regular therapy sessions, working to understand her own role in the program and its impact on their family. James stood in the doorway, watching both of them, noting how the tension that had once filled these spaces was slowly being replaced by something new. "He's composing again," Victoria observed softly, "different from what the program encouraged." Indeed, Thomas's music had evolved, where once he had created perfectly structured pieces designed to demonstrate his psychological conditioning, now his compositions flowed with genuine emotion and personal expression. "I found something," Thomas called out, pausing in his playing. He pulled out a folder from beneath the piano bench, old sheet music from his early lessons, before the program began to influence his artistic development. Victoria moved closer, recognizing her own handwriting on the margins of the pages, encouraging notes, simple praise, moments of genuine maternal pride untainted by corporate ambition. "You used to write little stories about each piece," Thomas said, showing her the annotations, "about how the music made you feel, what pictures it painted in your mind. That stopped when the program started." James joined them at the piano, seeing how this simple discovery affected Victoria. Her carefully maintained composure wavered as she traced her old handwriting with trembling fingers. "The program, it didn't just change how we saw you," Victoria admitted, looking at Thomas. "It changed how I saw everything. Music became another tool for conditioning. Art became documentation. Every moment became an opportunity for programming." Thomas began to play a new composition, one that incorporated themes from his earliest pieces, but transformed them into something more complex, more honest. The melody carried echoes of their family's journey, the harmony they once had, the discord that followed, and now the careful reconstruction of trust. "I've been working with Dr. Carter on this," Thomas explained between phrases. "She says, music can tell stories that words can't, so I'm telling our story." The piece moved through different movements, each representing a phase of their family's experience. The light, playful themes of early childhood gave way to more structured, controlled passages representing the program's influence. But then the music transformed, incorporating both elements into something new and healing. Victoria's therapy journal lay open on her lap, its pages filled with her own process of understanding and recovery. She had been documenting her journey, not to control or manipulate, but to understand and heal. "I found my old recordings," she said quietly, as Thomas played. "From when we first started the Institute, the original vision was so different, preventing suffering, supporting families, helping people heal. Somewhere along the way, prevention became prediction, and prediction became control." James watched as their son's music brought forth emotions that months of therapy had struggled to access. The program had taught Thomas to observe and analyze, but his natural empathy had transformed these skills into tools for understanding and connection. "There's a performance next week at the Institute," Thomas said, turning to face both his parents. "In the new family therapy wing. I want to play this piece, our whole story, and I want both of you there." The invitation hung in the air, weighted with significance. It would be the first time they would appear together publicly since the program's exposure. Victoria's eyes met James's, seeking something. Permission, understanding, forgiveness, perhaps. "The children in therapy have been asking about you," Thomas continued, his fingers still moving across the keys. Not about the program, but about how people can change, how families can heal. Victoria's therapy journal fell open to a recent entry, revealing her own drawings, not the precise diagrams of the program, but emotional sketches mirroring her son's artistic style. She had been learning to see the world through his eyes, understanding the difference between observation and connection. "The program taught us that control brings certainty," she said, watching Thomas play. "But I'm learning that some of the most important things in life can't be controlled. They can only be experienced, understood, and cherished." James moved to sit beside Victoria, their first moment of physical proximity in months that wasn't shaped by tension or fear. Together, they watched their son transform their family's story into music, each note a step toward healing. The Institute's new family therapy wing was filled to capacity for Thomas's performance. Families touched by the program sat alongside. Board members and staff, all gathered to witness something more than just a musical recital. This was a statement about transformation, about the possibility of healing even after betrayal. James sat in the front row, with Victoria beside him, their first public appearance as a family since the program's exposure. Thomas had been clear about wanting them both there, understanding that their presence together would send a powerful message to other families struggling to rebuild trust. "The piece I'm going to play," Thomas addressed the audience, his voice steady, is called Patterns of Truth. It's about seeing clearly, about using understanding for healing instead of control. As Thomas began to play, images of his artwork were projected on the wall behind him, not just the documentation of the program, but the whole journey of their family. The music moved through different phases, each corresponding to the visual story being told. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she watched their story unfold through their son's art and music. Her therapy journal lay open in her lap, its pages filled with her own process of understanding how protection had warped into control. The melody shifted into a section that represented the program's influence, structured, precise, but with an underlying tension that made listeners uncomfortable. In the audience, other children who had been evaluated for the program shifted in their seats, recognizing the feeling of being observed, analyzed, shaped. But then the music transformed. Thomas introduced a new theme, one that took the technical precision the program had taught him and married it with genuine emotion. The result was something powerful, a demonstration of how understanding could serve healing rather than control. James noticed how the other families in the audience responded to this transformation. Parents who had struggled with similar pressures of legacy and succession saw in Thomas's performance a different way forward. Children who had felt the weight of corporate expectations found hope in his ability to reclaim his gifts for his own purpose. As the piece reached its final movement, Thomas incorporated something new, a subtle echo of Victoria's old lullaby, the one she used to sing before the program changed their family dynamics. Victoria's breath caught at the familiar melody, now woven into a larger story of healing and reconciliation. The Kusi performance ended with a delicate balance between structure and freedom, control and trust. The audience sat in silence for a moment before erupting in applause. But Thomas wasn't finished. He turned to face the crowd, his expression serious. "When I was in the program, they taught me to see patterns everywhere," he said. "They wanted me to use that skill to continue their work. But instead, I learned that understanding patterns doesn't mean you have to follow them. You can create new ones." He gestured to the artwork displayed behind him. These drawings started as a way to document what was happening. Now they're helping other families understand their own stories. The Institute was built to prevent suffering, and now it's doing that again, just in a different way than before. Victoria stood up, moving to join Thomas at the piano. Her corporate armor was gone, replaced by a more genuine presence. "The program was wrong," she addressed the audience, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "We thought we could protect our children's futures by controlling their development. Instead, we nearly lost the very things that make them exceptional: their humanity, their ability to choose, their capacity for genuine connection." James joined them, completing the family picture. But this was no staged photograph or manipulated image. This was real. 3 people learning to trust again, to see each other clearly, to choose healing over control. The Institute's board chairman approached the piano carrying a folder of official documents. "The transformation of our prevention program is now complete," he announced. "The new family therapy wing, inspired by Thomas's designs, will serve as a model for other institutions facing similar challenges." Thomas turned to his parents, AEEU's new drawing in his hands. It showed the 3 of them as they were now, not perfect, not programmed, but genuinely connected. In the background, he had drawn the Institute, its windows bright with possibility, its doors open to families seeking healing rather than control. The elementary school auditorium buzzed with anticipation as families gathered for the annual Heritage Project presentations. This year's theme was Family Legacies, and Thomas Harrison stood backstage, preparing for what would become a pivotal moment in his journey of healing. Miss Anderson, who had supported Thomas throughout his artistic development, helped him arrange his presentation materials. Unlike the other students' traditional family tree displays, Thomas had created something uniquely powerful, a visual journey of transformation. "Are you sure about this?" James asked his son quietly, noting Victoria's absence in the audience. She had been invited, but had expressed concern about how other parents might react to her presence. "She'll come," Thomas replied with quiet confidence, adding final touches to his display. "She's different now, we all are." The presentation began with Thomas's newest creation, a large mural depicting the Institute's evolution. The left side showed the clinical prevention facilities of the past, while the right revealed the warm, healing spaces of the present. But it was the center that caught everyone's attention, a family portrait unlike any other. "My project is about how legacies can change," Thomas began, his voice clear and steady, "how they can heal and grow into something better than before." He spoke. The auditorium door opened quietly. Victoria slipped in, choosing a seat near the back. She wore none of her usual corporate polish, instead appearing natural and genuine. Several parents turned to look, but Thomas continued without missing a beat. "My family built the Prevention Health Institute to help people," he explained, pointing to early photographs. "But sometimes, when we try too hard to control the future, we forget about the present." He revealed a series of his drawings, now familiar to many in the community. They told the story of the program, but not as a scandal or tragedy. Instead, they showed a journey of understanding, how good intentions could go astray and how truth could lead to healing. "The program taught me to observe everything," Thomas continued, gesturing to detailed sketches of security cameras and monitoring systems. "They wanted me to learn how to control things like they did, but instead, I learned how to see things clearly." In the audience, other children from corporate families leaned forward, recognizing their own experiences. In Thomas's words, parents shifted uncomfortably, perhaps seeing reflections of their own expectations and fears. "But this project isn't just about what went wrong," Thomas said, moving to the newer artwork. "It's about what we're building now." He unveiled his latest piece, a triptych showing the Institute's transformation. The first panel depicted the clinical prevention programs of the past. The second showed the confusion and pain of the program's exposure, but it was the third panel that drew gasps from the audience. The final image showed the new family therapy wing, but not as a sterile medical facility. Thomas had captured the warmth of the art therapy rooms, the comfort of the counseling spaces, and most importantly, the genuine connections being formed there. "My mum thought she was protecting our future," Thomas said, looking directly at Victoria in the back of the room. "The program taught her that control meant safety, but she learned something more important, that real safety comes from understanding and love." Victoria stood slowly, moving to join James near the stage. The audience watched, some with surprise, others with understanding, as she took her place beside her family. "The Institute helps people prevent suffering," Thomas continued, "but now we do it by healing together, not by trying to control each other." He revealed his final piece, a new family portrait. but this one included elements from every stage of their journey. The security cameras were there but faded into the background. The clinical spaces had become places of healing. And in the center, 3 people stood together, each holding a piece of their shared story. James with his original vision of prevention, Victoria with her hard-won wisdom about protection versus control, and Thomas with his art that had helped bridge understanding. My legacy isn't just about running the institute someday, Thomas concluded. It's about continuing to help families heal, to see clearly, and to choose love over fear. Miss Anderson stepped forward, tears in her eyes. Thomas's project shows us something profound about family legacies. They're not just about preserving what was, they're about growing into what could be. The applause was interrupted by a small voice from the audience. Another student, the child of a prominent business family, stood up. "Can you teach us?" she asked Thomas. "Not just about drawing, but about seeing things clearly." Thomas looked at his parents, seeing in their faces the same understanding he had reached. The skills the program had tried to instill for control could be transformed into tools for healing. The legacy they were creating wasn't about succession or power. It was about teaching others to find their own path to truth and connection. 1 year after Thomas's school presentation, the Harrison Mansion had undergone a transformation as profound as its inhabitants. The security cameras were gone, replaced by Thomas's artwork. The hidden rooms had been opened and repurposed. Even Victoria's old office, once the command center of the program, had become a bright studio where she and Thomas often painted together. On this particular morning, the family gathered in the garden where everything had begun, where Thomas had first whispered his observation about the champagne glass at his birthday party. But now, instead of elaborate decorations and corporate guests, the space was filled with families from the Institute's therapy program. "It's strange," Victoria said, watching children play freely on the lawn. "How different everything looks when you stop trying to control it." She had completed her own therapy journey, working through the complex layers of fear and ambition that had led her to embrace the program. Her corporate suits had given way to casual elegance, her calculated gestures replaced by genuine warmth. Thomas sat at the garden piano, the same one that had once been used to measure his progress in the program. Now he played freely, creating music that blended structure and emotion. Around him, other children from the therapy program drew and painted, each finding their own way to express their experiences. "Dr. Carter says the Institute's new approach is being noticed," James mentioned, joining them. "Other healthcare facilities are interested in our family therapy model." The Prevention Health Institute had indeed been transformed. The research wing that once housed the behavioral modification program now served as a center for family healing. Thomas's drawings hung in every therapy room, helping other children understand and express their own stories. "Dad," Thomas called out, pausing in his playing, "I want to show you something." He led his parents to a new mural he had created on the garden wall, a piece that captured their entire journey. But unlike his earlier documentation of the program, this work focused on transformation and healing. "See how the patterns change." He pointed to various sections. "The program taught me to look for controlling patterns, but now I see different ones, patterns of growth, of healing, of love." Victoria traced a section of the mural that showed her own transformation. "I thought I was creating your future," she said softly to Thomas, "but you were the one who showed us a better way forward." The Institute's board chairman arrived for the informal gathering, carrying news about the complete dismantling of similar programs at other institutions. "Your story," he told Thomas, "has sparked a nationwide conversation about family legacy and corporate succession." But Thomas was already focused on something else, helping a young girl from the therapy program express her own story through art. She was the daughter of a corporate CEO, struggling with expectations much like Thomas had. "The key," Thomas told her, guiding her hand with the paintbrush, "is to use the understanding they want you to have, but for healing instead of control." James watched his son, seeing not the programmed successor Victoria had once envisioned, but a natural healer who had transformed tools of control into instruments of understanding. Later that evening, as the families departed and the garden grew quiet, Thomas sat between his parents on the piano bench. His fingers found a melody, the one from the party where everything had begun, but now it transformed into something new, something healing. The program tried to make me see things their way, Thomas said, playing softly. But you taught me to see with my heart, Dad. And Mom, you showed me that people can change when they choose to see clearly too. Victoria opened her therapy journal, sharing her latest entry, a drawing of her own, inspired by Thomas's style. It showed their family not as perfect corporate successes, but as growing, healing human beings. The Institute's original mission was prevention, James reflected. We just had to learn that preventing suffering doesn't mean controlling life. It means understanding, supporting, and loving through all its uncertainties. Thomas's music filled the garden as the sun set, carrying the story of their transformation into the evening air. The security cameras were gone, the hidden rooms exposed, the masks of perfection discarded. In their place was something far more valuable, a family legacy built not on control and succession, but on truth, healing, and love. This is our real legacy, Thomas said, playing the final notes of his composition. Not what we build or control, but how we help others heal and grow. As darkness fell, the garden lights came on. Not the harsh spotlights of surveillance, but warm lanterns that cast a gentle glow. In their light, 3 people